The year was 1334 BCE, and the sun hung low over the horizon of Akhenaten, casting long shadows across the once magnificent capital of Egypt. The city that Pharaoh Akhenaten had built to honor his one true god, the Aten, now stood silent and vulnerable. Within the grand palace walls, 6 young princesses huddled together in the royal chambers, their world about to shatter in ways that would echo through history for millennia. What happened to these daughters of Nefertiti in the days following their father's death remains one of ancient Egypt's darkest secrets, a tale so disturbing that subsequent pharaohs tried desperately to erase every trace of it from official records. But the truth, as it always does, survived in whispered accounts, hidden inscriptions, and archaeological evidence that continues to emerge even today. Nefertiti, the eldest daughter at just 17 years old, stood at the window of the women's quarters, watching as dust clouds rose in the distance. She had been named Great Royal Wife after her mother Nefertiti's mysterious disappearance 3 years earlier, a title that now felt like a death sentence rather than an honor. Her younger sisters gathered behind her: Akhenaten, Akhenaten, Nefertiti Tashret, Neferneferor, and little Setapenra, the youngest at barely 9 years old. They had grown up in unprecedented luxury and privilege, daughters of the most powerful couple in the known world. Their father had revolutionized Egyptian religion, abandoning the old gods in favor of monotheistic worship of the sun disk. Their mother had been the most beautiful and influential queen Egypt had ever known, depicted in temple reliefs as equal to the pharaoh himself. But now, everything they had ever known was crumbling around them. The princesses had been raised in isolation within their father's utopian city, shielded from the growing discontent that festered throughout Egypt. Akhenaten's religious revolution had not been welcomed by everyone. The powerful priests of Ammonius had watched their temples close, their wealth confiscated, their influence evaporate. The military commanders had grown restless as Egypt's empire weakened, with vassal states in Syria and Canaan sending desperate letters begging for help against invaders, while the pharaoh remained obsessed with his religious reforms. The common people suffered as resources were diverted to building Akhenaten instead of maintaining the irrigation systems and granaries that kept Egypt prosperous. And the noble families of Thebes, Memphis, and other ancient cities seethed with resentment at being forced to abandon their ancestral homes and relocate to this new capital in the middle of nowhere. Nefertiti had seen the signs, even if her younger sisters had not. The way the palace guards had dwindled in number over the past months. The whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when she entered a room. The increasingly frantic messages from her father's few remaining loyal officials. The way the servants had begun looking at her with pity rather than deference. She had tried to prepare herself for what might come, but nothing could have truly prepared her for the reality of what was about to unfold. The sound of distant shouting reached the palace, growing louder with each passing moment. Nefertiti turned from the window to face her sisters, forcing herself to appear calm even as her heart raced with terror. Akhenaten, at 13 years old, was old enough to understand the danger they faced. Her eyes were wide with fear as she clutched little Setapenra to her chest. The middle sisters huddled together on cushions, their elaborate wigs and jewelry suddenly seeming absurd and fragile. These girls, who had never known anything but absolute power and privilege, were about to discover just how quickly the world could turn against them. The doors to their chambers burst open, and a group of men in the uniforms of the palace guard rushed in. But Nefertiti recognized immediately that something was wrong. These were not their usual protectors. The insignia on their armor bore the symbols of Ammonius, the very god her father had tried to erase from Egyptian consciousness. At their head stood a man she had seen before in the throne room, standing silently among the crowds of petitioners and officials. His name was Hormheb, a general who had once served her grandfather with distinction, but had been sidelined during her father's reign. His face was hard and cold as he surveyed the frightened princesses before him. Behind Hormheb came other familiar faces, nobles and priests whose families had been powerful before Akhenaten's reforms, men who had been forced to publicly worship the Aten while privately nursing their hatred and planning their revenge. And there, emerging from the shadows like a specter, was I, the elderly courtier who had served as her father's chief advisor. Nefertiti felt her blood run cold at the sight of him. I had always been there, a fixture of palace life, his weathered face betraying nothing of his thoughts. He had counseled Akhenaten, had appeared to support the religious reforms, had seemed loyal to the royal family. But now, as he looked at the princesses with eyes devoid of compassion, Nefertiti understood that whatever loyalty he had shown had been nothing but a performance, a patient game played across decades while he waited for this moment. Horemheb spoke first, his voice echoing in the suddenly silent chamber. He announced that Pharaoh Akhenaten was dead, struck down by illness, though the way he said it made clear that illness was merely the official story. He declared that the heretical reign of the Aten worshipper had ended, that Egypt would return to the old gods, the true gods, the gods that had made Egypt great. The city of Akhenaten would be abandoned, its temples demolished, its very name erased from history. And as for the pharaoh's daughters, the living embodiments of the heresy that had nearly destroyed Egypt, they would face the judgment they deserved. The younger princesses began to cry, their sobs filling the chamber. Nefertiti stepped forward, drawing herself up to her full height, trying to channel the queenly authority her mother had possessed. She reminded Horemheb that she was great royal wife, that royal blood flowed through her veins, that the gods themselves had ordained her family's right to rule. But her words fell on deaf ears. Horemheb laughed, a harsh sound that held no mirth, and gestured to the men behind him. The old order had returned, he told her, and in that order, women who had dared to claim power equal to men, who had allowed their father to corrupt Egypt's sacred traditions, had no place. What happened next would haunt those chambers forever. The soldiers moved forward, and despite Nefertiti's attempts to shield her sisters, they were torn apart. The elaborate jewelry they wore, the gold and lapis lazuli that marked their royal status, was ripped from their bodies. Their fine linen dresses were torn away. The wigs they wore, styled in the latest fashion of Akhenaten, were pulled from their heads. They were being stripped not just of their clothing, but of their very identity as royal princesses. In ancient Egypt, appearance was everything. The elaborate dress, jewelry, and makeup of the nobility were not mere vanity, but visible manifestations of their divine right to rule. To strip someone of these markers was to strip them of their humanity, to reduce them from divine beings to something less than human. The princesses were dragged from their chambers, their screams echoing through the palace halls. Servants who had once attended to their every need now turned away, unwilling or unable to help. Some wept quietly, but none dared to intervene. The power structure had shifted completely, and everyone in the palace understood that association with Akhenaten's family was now a death sentence. As the girls were hauled through corridors they had walked freely all their lives, they passed walls covered in painted reliefs showing their family in happier times. Images of Akhenaten and Nefertiti offering to the Aten, of the 6 princesses playing beneath the rays of the sun disk, of a utopian vision that had never quite become reality. Soon, workers would begin the process of chiseling away these images, erasing the heretic pharaoh and his family from history itself. They were taken to the lower levels of the palace, to areas the princesses had never seen before. Here, beneath the grand halls and beautiful gardens, lay the functional spaces that kept the palace running: storerooms, workshops, and dungeons. The air grew thick and hot as they descended, the smell of unwashed bodies and human waste becoming overpowering. The youngest princesses could barely walk, their legs giving out from terror and exhaustion, and they were dragged along the stone floors. Nefertiti tried to maintain her composure, to be strong for her sisters, but the reality of their situation was becoming impossible to deny. They were no longer princesses. They were prisoners, and their captors had no intention of showing them mercy. The cells they were thrown into were tiny, barely large enough for one person, let alone 6. The stone walls were covered in ancient stains whose origin Nefertiti did not want to contemplate. There was no furniture, no bedding, nothing but bare stone and a small grate in the ceiling that provided minimal ventilation. The door slammed shut behind them with a sound of finality that made even Nefertiti's courage falter. In the darkness, the 6 sisters clung to each other, their royal upbringing providing no preparation for this nightmare they now inhabited. Days passed, though in the darkness it was impossible to know how many. Food and water were provided irregularly, thrown through a slot in the door without ceremony. It was the plainest fare imaginable, coarse bread and warm water, a far cry from the elaborate meals the princesses were accustomed to. Little Setapenra could barely eat, her body rejecting food in her state of terror and distress. Akhenaten tried to comfort her, singing the lullabies their mother had once sung to them, but her voice cracked with emotion and thirst. The middle sisters had retreated into silence, sitting motionless against the walls, as if hoping to disappear entirely. But the physical deprivation was only the beginning of their ordeal. Horemheb and the other architects of the coup understood that simply imprisoning the princesses was not enough. These girls represented everything that had been wrong with Akhenaten's reign. The elevation of women to positions of power, the disruption of traditional gender roles, the challenge to the male-dominated priesthood and military. To truly erase Akhenaten's legacy, his daughters had to be not just removed from power but systematically broken, humiliated, and destroyed. What the old guard had in mind for them was a campaign of psychological and physical torture designed to demonstrate once and for all that women who dared to rise above their station would be brought low in the most degrading ways imaginable. The first interrogation came without warning. Guards burst into the cell and dragged Nefertiti out, leaving her screaming sisters behind. She was brought before a tribunal of priests and nobles, men whose faces she recognized from her years in the palace, but who now looked at her with undisguised contempt. They demanded that she confess to her family's crimes, that she publicly renounce the Aten and acknowledge the supremacy of Ammonius and the other traditional gods. They wanted her to admit that her father had been mad, that her mother had been a manipulative witch who had bewitched the pharaoh, that the entire royal family had conspired against Egypt's interests. Nefertiti refused. Despite everything, despite the terror and the degradation, some core of royal dignity remained within her. She was the daughter of Nefertiti, the most powerful woman Egypt had ever known. She had been raised to believe in her own divine nature, in her right to rule. She would not give her captors the satisfaction of hearing her renounce everything she had been. Her refusal was met with violence. The priests nodded to the guards, and Nefertiti was beaten with rods until she collapsed on the floor, her body covered in bruises and welts. But still she would not recant. Her stubbornness seemed to enrage her interrogators further, and they ordered even harsher treatment. Over the following weeks, each of the princesses was subjected to similar interrogations. Akhenaten, strong-willed like her older sister, also refused to cooperate and received the same brutal treatment. The younger girls, terrified and broken, said whatever their captors wanted to hear, but it made no difference. The priests and nobles conducting these sessions were not really interested in confessions. They wanted to inflict pain, to assert their dominance, to punish these women for daring to be born into a family that had challenged their power. The fact that the princesses were children, that they had no real responsibility for their father's policies, was irrelevant. They were symbols, and symbols could be destroyed with impunity. But the physical beatings were not the worst of what the princesses endured. The elderly advisor who had served their father, had his own plans for them. He recognized that Nefertiti and Akhenaten, despite their youth, were potential threats. Both girls had been married to their father in the later years of his reign, following the Egyptian royal practice of keeping the bloodline pure. Both had been great royal wife at different times. Both had a legitimate claim to power, or could be used by Akhenaten's remaining supporters to challenge the new regime. I understood that these girls needed to be neutralized in a way that would make them unsuitable for any future political role. The ancient Egyptian concept of ritual purity was complex and all-encompassing. A pharaoh or member of the royal family was expected to maintain spiritual and physical purity through elaborate daily rituals, adherence to dietary restrictions, and avoidance of anything that could be considered defiling. A person who was considered ritually impure could not participate in religious ceremonies, could not enter temples, and could not hold positions of spiritual or political authority. I's plan was to render the princesses ritually impure in ways that could never be undone, ensuring that even if they somehow escaped or were later released, they could never reclaim their royal status. The details of what was done to Nefertiti and her sisters in those underground cells are almost too horrific to recount. Archaeological evidence from later periods, combined with fragmentary accounts that survived in the records of temple priests, paint a picture of systematic degradation that violated every social and religious norm of ancient Egyptian society. The princesses were forced to consume foods that were considered taboo. breaking fundamental religious laws. They were exposed to dead bodies and human waste, things that would render them unclean according to Egyptian belief. They were subjected to mock rituals that perverted sacred ceremonies, designed to spiritually taint them in ways that no amount of purification could undo. Nefertiti, as the eldest and most prominent, received the worst treatment. There are hints in later documents that she was forced into a form of ritual marriage with priests of Ammonius, ceremonies designed to symbolically transfer her royal legitimacy to the restored priesthood, while simultaneously defiling her in ways that would make her unacceptable as a bride to any noble. These were not real marriages but grotesque parodies, conducted in darkness by men who viewed her not as a person, but as a political problem to be solved. The trauma of these experiences broke something fundamental in Nefertiti. Witnesses later reported that when she was finally brought out of the cells, she no longer spoke, her eyes vacant and staring, her mind having retreated from a reality too painful to endure. The younger princesses suffered differently, but no less terribly. There are indications that some of them were essentially sold or given to various nobles and officials as rewards for their support of the coup, treated as property to be distributed like gold or land. These transactions were not recorded in official documents, of course, but traces of them appear in private correspondence and estate records from the period. Girls who had once been among the most privileged people on earth, waited on hand and foot by armies of servants, now found themselves as concubines in the households of men who viewed them with a mixture of lust and contempt. Their royal blood, instead of protecting them, made them particularly prized trophies, living proof of the old regime's downfall. Little Setapenra, the youngest, simply could not survive what was done to her. The exact cause of her death is not recorded, but given her age and the conditions in which the princesses were held, it is not difficult to imagine. Whether it was disease, malnutrition, physical abuse, or simply the psychological trauma of losing everything and everyone she had ever known, the 9-year-old princess died in those dark cells beneath the palace. Her body was not given the elaborate mummification and burial rites that should have been her birthright. Instead, she was disposed of quickly and quietly, her death not even recorded in official documents. It was as if she had never existed at all. The fate of each princess varied in the months following their initial imprisonment, but none of them fared well. Nefertiti's story is particularly tragic. Some evidence suggests she was married off to a minor official in a distant province, far from the centers of power. Stripped of her royal titles and identity, forced to live as the wife of a man far beneath her former station, she disappeared from the historical record entirely. Whether she lived out her days in quiet desperation or died young is unknown. Her name, like those of most of her sisters, was deliberately erased from monuments and official documents in the years that followed. Nefertiti, Tashret, and Nefer, the middle daughters, seem to have been kept in some form of captivity for a longer period. There are references in temple records to women of the heretic's house, being used as laborers in the rebuilding of Ammonius temples in Thebes. These women, almost certainly including some of Akhenaten's daughters, were put to work in the most degrading tasks imaginable: cleaning, carrying water, preparing offerings. They worked alongside common criminals and prisoners of war, their royal background counting for nothing. It was a deliberate reversal of the natural order as the Egyptians understood it, with those who had been highest brought to the absolute lowest point. Akhenaten's fate is perhaps the most documented, though no less disturbing for being better known. Despite the trauma she endured in those cells, despite everything that was done to her, she survived. And because she survived, because she was young and still potentially fertile, she became useful to those who had overthrown her father. Now maneuvering to claim the throne for himself, recognized that marrying one of Akhenaten's daughters would give him a claim to royal legitimacy that he otherwise lacked. Akhenaten, perhaps the most resilient of the sisters, was chosen for this purpose. But before I could act, another player entered the game. A young man named Akhenaten, who had been born into the royal family during Akhenaten's reign, was put forward as pharaoh by those who wanted a more malleable ruler. He was only about 9 years old, barely older than the princesses had been when their father died. And in a move that had become all too common in Egyptian royal politics, he was married to Akhenaten, his own half-sister, to legitimize his claim to the throne. The girl who had suffered so much in those underground cells was now queen again, but it was a hollow title. She was a figurehead, a symbol used by men like Ai and Horemheb to maintain their grip on power. Historical records show that Akhenaten tried desperately to escape her situation. Letters have been discovered in which she wrote to the Hittite king, Egypt's traditional enemy, begging him to send one of his sons to marry her and become pharaoh. She was willing to betray her own country, willing to hand over Egypt to foreigners, if it meant escaping the control of the men who had destroyed her family and continued to control her life. The Hittite prince who was sent in response to her letters was murdered before he could reach Egypt, almost certainly on orders from Ai or Horemheb. After Tutankhamun's early death, Akhenaten was forced to marry Ai himself, the elderly man who had helped orchestrate her family's downfall. The marriage did not last long, and Akhenaten disappears from historical records shortly after. Whether she died naturally, took her own life, or was murdered is unknown. As for Nefertiti, the proud eldest daughter who had tried so hard to protect her sisters, her ultimate fate remains one of history's mysteries. Some Egyptologists believe she may be identical to a female pharaoh named Nefertiti, who briefly ruled after Akhenaten's death, before being overthrown and erased from official records. If this is true, it means that Nefertiti somehow managed to claim power, however briefly, despite everything that had been done to her. But the archaeological evidence is fragmentary and disputed. What is certain is that a woman matching Nefertiti's description appears in some unofficial documents from the period, described as living in seclusion in the old palace at Akhenaten, the now abandoned city her father had built. These accounts describe a woman who rarely spoke, who spent her days staring at the painted walls showing her family in happier times, waiting for death to release her from memories too painful to bear. The systematic erasure of Akhenaten's family from Egyptian records makes it difficult to trace the princess's individual fates with certainty. The new regime, eventually led by Horemheb after Ai's death, undertook an extensive campaign to remove all trace of the heretic pharaoh and his religious revolution. The city of Akhenaten was abandoned completely, left to be swallowed by the desert sands. The temples to the Aten were demolished, their stone blocks repurposed for other building projects. Every inscription bearing Akhenaten's name was chiseled away. Every relief showing his face was defaced. And his family, including his 6 daughters, were simply erased from the official narrative of Egyptian history. Later king lists skipped directly from Amenhotep III to Horemheb, as if the entire Amarna period had never happened. But while the official records were purged, the truth survived in other forms. The workers who had lived in Akhenaten remembered. The servants who had fled the palace carried stories with them. Priests who had participated in the persecutions confessed to colleagues in private moments. These accounts, passed down through generations, preserved fragments of what had really happened. Archaeological excavations in the 20th and 21st centuries have uncovered more evidence. The abandoned city of Akhenaten itself, the royal tombs that were vandalized and robbed in antiquity, and most tellingly, the bodies. In 2012, archaeologists working in the desert near Akhenaten discovered a mass burial site containing numerous bodies from the Amarna period. Among them were the remains of several young women of high status, based on the quality of the few surviving grave goods and the position of the bodies. Forensic analysis revealed that these women had died young and had suffered significant trauma during their lives. Healed fractures, signs of malnutrition, evidence of repeated physical abuse. The bones told a story that aligned horrifyingly well with the fragmentary historical accounts of what happened to Akhenaten's daughters. While positive identification is impossible after more than 3,000 years, many Egyptologists believe that some of these remains belong to the lost princesses of the Amarna period. The psychological impact of what these young women endured cannot be overstated. They grew up believing they were divine, that they were chosen by the gods, that they were destined for greatness. The shock of discovering that all of this was illusion, that their status and safety could be stripped away in an instant, that the people they had trusted could turn on them so completely, it must have been utterly shattering. Modern psychology recognizes that trauma experienced during adolescence, when identity is still forming, can have particularly devastating and long-lasting effects. The princesses did not just lose their family and their position. They lost their fundamental understanding of who they were and how the world worked. There is something uniquely horrifying about the systematic nature of what was done to Akhenaten's daughters. This was not random violence or the chaos of war. It was calculated, deliberate, and carried out by people who believed they were acting righteously. The priests who orchestrated the religious rituals that defiled the princesses thought they were cleansing Egypt of heresy. The nobles who distributed the younger girls as rewards thought they were establishing the proper hierarchy. When he married Akhenaten, thought he was legitimizing his rule in accordance with tradition. Everyone involved had justifications for their actions, which makes the horror of what happened all the more disturbing. The fate of Nefertiti's daughters serves as a brutal reminder of how quickly power can shift, and how those at the top can fall to the very bottom with stunning speed. In ancient Egypt, as in many historical societies, women's power was always derivative and conditional. Even Nefertiti, at the height of her influence, derived her authority from her relationship to the pharaoh. When Akhenaten died and the political winds shifted, his daughters had no independent power base to protect them. They were assets to be exploited or obstacles to be removed, not individuals with rights or agency of their own. The story also illuminates the deeply misogynistic undercurrents of ancient Egyptian society that are often overlooked in popular depictions of ancient Egypt as relatively egalitarian. While it is true that Egyptian women had more legal rights than their counterparts in many other ancient civilizations, the Amarna period and its aftermath show the limits of those rights. When Akhenaten elevated women to unprecedented positions of power and religious significance, allowing Nefertiti to participate in religious ceremonies traditionally reserved for men and depicting his daughters as central to his religious vision, he was challenging fundamental assumptions about gender and power. The viciousness with which his daughters were treated after his death was not just political but deeply personal, a reassertion of male dominance through the systematic destruction of women who had dared to claim authority. It is worth considering what lessons, if any, can be drawn from this ancient tragedy. The fate of Nefertiti's daughters demonstrates the vulnerability of even the most privileged women in societies where power is structured along patriarchal lines. Their royal blood and divine status meant nothing when the men who actually controlled military force and religious institutions decided to move against them. This pattern has repeated throughout history. Women who gain power through marriage or birth often lose it just as quickly when their male protectors die or fall from favor. The erasure of the princesses from official records also speaks to how history is written by victors, and how the perspectives and experiences of women are often the first to be lost. We know far more about Horemheb's military campaigns and ICE political maneuverings than we do about what happened to 6 young women who suffered tremendously. Their pain was not considered historically important enough to record in detail. It took thousands of years and the development of modern archaeological techniques for us to begin recovering their stories from fragmentary evidence and scattered references. In recent years, there has been renewed scholarly interest in the women of the Amarna period, driven partly by feminist historians who recognize the importance of recovering women's stories from historical silence. Excavations continue at Akhenaten and other sites, uncovering new evidence. Advances in forensic archaeology allow us to learn more from skeletal remains. Digital technologies enable new analyses of inscriptions that earlier scholars dismissed as illegible. Each new discovery adds another piece to the puzzle of what really happened to Akhenaten's daughters. But even with all our modern tools and techniques, huge gaps remain in the historical record. We will never know exactly what Nefertiti thought as she watched her world collapse. We will never know what Setepenra's last days were like in those dark cells. We will never know the full extent of what Akhenaten endured before she disappeared from history. The silence that the coup's architects imposed so thoroughly has never been fully broken, and perhaps never will be. What we do know is that 6 young women, who should have lived lives of privilege and died surrounded by honors, were instead subjected to horrors that would haunt anyone's nightmares. They were beaten, starved, abused, defiled, and erased, their very existence becoming an inconvenient fact that later generations tried to forget. Their suffering was not an accident or collateral damage, but the result of deliberate choices made by men who believed that crushing these particular women was necessary and justified. The tomb that was prepared for Akhenaten's family in the cliffs near Akhenaten stands empty today, looted and vandalized in antiquity. The beautiful reliefs that once covered its walls, showing the royal family in loving interaction, have been deliberately defaced. The sarcophagi that should have held the mummified bodies of the princesses are broken and scattered. It is a fitting metaphor for how thoroughly the victors tried to destroy not just the princesses' lives, but their memory as well. Yet despite all efforts at erasure, the story survives. The archaeological evidence, the fragmentary texts, the whispered accounts that were never quite silenced, they all testify to what happened in those terrible months after Akhenaten's death. When visitors to modern Egypt tour the great temples of Luxor and Karnak, they walk past walls covered in inscriptions and reliefs, showing the pharaohs who built and restored these monuments. Horemheb's cartouches appear frequently, boasting of his pious restoration of the old god's temples. But nowhere in these grand monuments is there any mention of what he did to achieve power, or what happened to the young women whose destruction paved his way to the throne. History, as preserved in stone and official records, is sanitized and heroic. The truth is buried in unmarked graves in the desert, waiting for archaeologists to uncover it piece by painful piece. The fate of Nefertiti's daughters haunts us not just because of the specific horrors they endured, but because their story illuminates uncomfortable truths about power, gender, and violence that remain relevant today. How quickly the powerful can fall, how vulnerable women remain even at the highest levels of society, how brutally those in power will act to maintain or reclaim dominance, how thoroughly the victors can erase the stories of those they destroy. These are not just ancient Egyptian problems, but human problems that echo across millennia. As the sun sets over the ruins of Akhenaten today, tourists and archaeologists walk through the remnants of Akhenaten's dream city. The grand palace where the princesses once lived is nothing but foundations and broken walls. The temple where their father worshipped his one god is rubble. The painted pavements where they played as children are faded and cracked. But sometimes, in the quiet moments of dawn or dusk, it is possible to imagine 6 young voices echoing through these ruins, singing the hymns to the Aten that their father composed, laughing together in the innocence of childhood before their world fell apart. The wind carries their ghosts still, a reminder that beneath the grand narratives of pharaohs and empires, there are individual human stories of suffering and loss that demand to be remembered, no matter how much time has passed or how thoroughly the powerful tried to erase them from memory.